I had to ask myself the question, just because our ancestors did things a certain way, does that mean that we need to do the exact same thing?
Right.
And the fact of the matter is that we live in a world that is extremely different from the world that our ancestors evolved in.
What would you give to people as your advice for the optimal health, the optimal diet?
Right.
What would that look like?
Well, you know, we've been talking about diet and health largely from a sort of a Paleolithic perspective. Of course, the subtitle of my book is Beyond the Paleo Diet for Total Health and a Longer Life, because I had to ask myself the question, just because our ancestors did things a certain way, does that mean that we need to do the exact same thing?
Right.
And the fact of the matter is that we live in a world that is extremely different from the world that our ancestors evolved in. We're actually, I think, even though we have a more temperate climate, we're being exposed to greater challenges than they could have imagined in their worst nightmares. Everything from the depleted, soils, which is the least of our worries, to environmental pollutants and toxins and excitotoxins and genetically modified organisms in our food supply, and this stressors like EMF and this 24-hour electricity, 24-hour-a-day sunlight that we call electricity. All of these things, there's so many stressors that we're being impacted with today, radiation exposure, all kinds of things, that we literally have, compared to them, no room for error. And we're living in a time period now where we're extraordinarily compromised. I mean, our genome is compromised already. And we're already in a place where we're vulnerable. And then we have all of this other stuff. And so the other part that I wanted to look at was, what does human longevity research have to say about what helps what helps us live the longest, right? How can we modify these principles to better optimize them for the world we live in today? When we look at what our ancestors were eating, does the fact that we were eating huge quantities of meat, that we were these extremely high-level carnivores, does that mean that we need to continue that way of eating today in order to be optimally healthy? Well, the current research in human longevity studies and whatever say no, that it's not necessarily beneficial to eat that much meat. But does this mean that we are of necessity, that we're extremely well suited to eating a diet that is based on animal source foods? You better believe it. That we have a hydrochloric acid based digestive system. Okay, we don't have a bacterially based digestive system, as most herbivores do. And in fact, one thing that's interesting, until relatively recently, it was thought that most of our primate ancestors were largely vegetarian. We know now, the research is very clear, that virtually all of them ate a significant amount of meat. Not as much as we tend to, but they all, Jane Goodall's research, we thought chimps were plant-based, had a plant-based diet, until she sat there and watched them killing and eating other monkeys and other small animals on a regular basis. And so we understand, and there's a wonderful book by Craig Stanford called The Hunting Apes. You can go in and read, and it's just right down to pygmy marmosets that eat mostly, actually they eat mostly animals, these tiny little primates. The exception are the mountain gorillas, but even they eat a significant number of insects along the way. So there are no vegan either primate ancestors or hominin ancestors. The earliest known human remains were of a hominid that they named Lucy, 3.39 million years ago. She was a representative of Australopithecus afarensis. And what they recently discovered was that even she created stone tools as a way of cleaving meat and marrow from the bones of animals that I don't know whether they were hunted or whether they were scavenged, remains to be determined. But what is clear, and what they have since determined through another recent study, is that from at least just over 2 million years ago, we had, we human beings or evolving hominins were basically operating in a state of what is called persistent carnivory. In other words, we had a hunting-based economy.
Okay.
Meat was not an occasional thing. Meat was a foundational thing from that point forward. So, so we're designed for that. Now the question becomes, well, you know, how much of that is optimal for us today? And it turns out that there are certain metabolic pathways that are associated with protein consumption that when we exceed what we actually need for our own maintenance and repair, beyond that threshold, we're upregulating certain metabolic pathways that activate, well, they're basically reproductive pathways. There are these sensors. Insulin is part of this whole equation as well. Insulin isn't a blood sugar hormone. Insulin exists in everything from yeast and microscopic worms through, you know, all animals and primates. We tend to secrete the most insulin in response to carbohydrate intake, because every molecule of carbohydrate that we don't need right now to outrun a cantankerous woolly mammoth is fundamentally in excessive, you know, is in excess of what we need at the moment. And so it's more likely to stimulate insulin to take and try to put it into storage somehow, whether in the form of glycogen or whether converted to triglycerides, you know, blood fats, to be deposited in places we'd rather not have them, many of us. So, so at any rate, so insulin is really, it will take excess nutrients and put them into storage. Primarily carbohydrates will stimulate insulin. Excess protein may as well. Okay. Fat doesn't seem to be part of that equation. I'm not going to make claims, but I can, you know, point you to the fact that there's a ton of research out there that shows that by moderating your protein intake and by adopting fat as a primary source of fuel as opposed to sugar as a primary source of fuel, you're basically not giving cancer anything to work with.
Right. That's the ketogenic diet they're starting to, which is fat burning,
big time,
is about, you know, is being used to help cancer, people that already have cancer, to starve it is what we're hearing. So I want to go back to
what is
that
the optimal
diet. What is in it and what isn't in it.
Right. So the fact that we don't have a fundamental human dietary requirement for carbohydrate, and the fact that sugar has a tendency to do a lot of damage. Okay, sugar will stimulate insulin, which we know from, there's all sorts of longevity research now. Cynthia Kenyon in the early 1990s did a lot of research with this to show that the more insulin we require over the course of our lifetimes, the less long we are likely to live and the more diseases and problems we are likely to have. I mean, when she got done with her research, she basically dumped the carbs out of her diet. And that's what I tend to recommend that people do as well, to the extent possible, getting rid of, you know, the sugars and starches to the extent possible. Moderating the protein intake, taking in what you need but not exceeding that too much. Most of us don't need more than 6 or 7 ounces of complete protein a day, but we do need the protein to be complete.
So you're not going to get that from your plant sources. Again,
no,
back
and you
to
can
what
combine rice and beans to try to, you know,
get the amino acids.
Right. So, but by creating that complete protein, that doesn't necessarily either imply protein sufficiency, and you're also adding a lot of starch to the equation when you're trying to combine proteins that way, and that's just not optimal. And so, eating as much fat as you need to in order to satisfy your appetite, which fat's certainly more calorically dense than either carbohydrates or protein. So this ends up being a high percentage fat diet, not necessarily a high fat diet, you know, although I'm fine with people eating as much fat as they feel the need to eat. I don't, you know, offer eat this many grams of fat a day. It will take care of itself because it's inherently very satiating. Fat is the one food to our brain that tells us that hunting is good. That when we are eating sufficient fats, it tells us that we're not starving and that we don't have to hang on to our fat reserves in our body, so we're freer to burn whatever that we have.
Yes.
And we're less likely to hoard energy that way. It's just a much freer flow. It's also very even burning, very long lasting. And I also advocate actually eating as many fibrous vegetables and greens as you feel the need to have, or as much as you want, and eating that raw, eating that cooked, because there are advantages and disadvantages to both. Cultured vegetables are marvelous. They tend to be more nutritious than than the raw vegetables they came from. And I probably eat more vegetables than most vegetarians or even vegans do. I mean, I eat quite a lot of that. And I think that they're more important to us now than they ever used to be to our evolutionary ancestors, just simply by virtue of the kind of environment that we live in today, the environmental pollutants and toxins and whatever. Plant foods tend to be fairly rich, well, fibrous plant foods anyway, and greens tend to be fairly rich in antioxidants and phytonutrients, and they're fairly detoxifying. And I think there's an advantage to that.
Take some of the toxins out of the system.
But remember that we lack the physiological makeup to make optimal use of those foods for our sole source of nutrition, right? That we have a very, we are actually designed to make use of fat as our primary source of fuel. And in fact, human infants are literally born in a state of ketosis. When they start, in fact, the moment they begin suckling, that the infant begins producing ketones, because mother's milk is extremely rich in medium chain fats that immediately convert to ketones as a primary fuel for brain development. Okay, it doesn't, and that's out of a Journal of Neurochemistry that I'm basically getting this information. And it doesn't say that, well, once the infant begins suckling, it starts burning glucose in its brain, as a source of brain fuel, et cetera. No, children and infants, they don't start trying to depend on glucose as their primary source of fuel until carbohydrates are introduced into the diet. We only have a requirement for glucose, and that's one of the myths in nutritional science and in that are taught to medical students and whoever else in health fields.
You need glucose for the brain.
Must be your primary source of fuel. That is only conditionally true. It is only true if you have metabolically adapted yourself, and rather unnaturally, I might add, to a dependence on glucose as your primary source of fuel. That we are otherwise, and it's a very volatile source of fuel to depend upon.
Well, everybody knows what a sugar high, sugar low. I mean, that's part of what, when we shifted to ketogenic, as you talked about the ketones, is surprising to me. My energy is even, the moods are even, which is of course part of the primal mind, part of this.
Absolutely.
And there's this sort of steady endurance quality, and I have sort of this sense, actually Robin says it now and then, is I'm ketogenic. I don't need to eat a meal. The body knows what to do with some of the extra fat, and it just steadily carries on.
Yeah.
I do want to add, by fats, you are not talking. Are you talking about the vegetable oils? Are you talking about flax? Are you talking about canola?
Those are extremely new fats to the human species.
Yes.
This is just the last couple, last 100 years or so, that we've been consuming those. Our ancestors wouldn't have taken a sunflower seed, mashed it up, and then fried up a woolly mammoth steak in that. They would have eaten the seed if they came across it, or a nut, or whatever, but they wouldn't have extracted the oil that way. There's certain oils like coconut oil and olive oil that are that can be extracted with a minimum of technology, and that I think have potentially marvelous healthful roles to play and are fine. Coconut oil is much better for cooking than olive oil is. But olive oil has some great properties, and they're discovering new antioxidants in olives and things that are really wonderful, and that's fine. But if we're talking about safflower oil, sunflower oil, oh God forbid cottonseed oil, which isn't even a food oil.
Flax seeds.
But flaxseed oil, The problem with flaxseed oil is that it is so highly polyunsaturated that usually the moment that you extract it from the seed, it's going rancid like that. And that's just it. There are so many polyunsaturates in these seed oils. Now, seed oils tend to be extremely high, most seed oils, in omega-6s, which we have some requirement for, but but consumed in excess will tend to drive us toward sort of pro-inflammatory pathways. They're more likely to trigger inflammation and squeeze out the much more needed nowadays omega-3 fatty acids. Now, the problem with flax oil sources of omega-3 and walnuts and chia seed sources of omega-3 and sanshanichi and all these other newfangled sources of plant-based omega-3s is that there is a huge metabolic conversion that has to, and many steps in that metabolic conversion that it has to undergo in order to become the elongated form of omega-3 that our bodies and brain actually make the most use of, EPA and DHA.
The best bet is
Yes.
not a lot of the seed oils.
Right.
And they're going rancid. So
And they're going rancid, yeah. They go rancid, and they're not the best source of omega-3s for us. We just cannot make that kind of use. You are lucky to make maybe 3 to 5% EPA out of the plant-based omega-3s that you consume. In other words, if everything is working right in your body, it's all optimal.
You're still going to get just as
and you have the right genetic makeup, because if you're Northern European or of Celtic descent or of native descent, you can't do this at all. You can't make any EPA or DHA from that at all. But if everything is working right, you don't have any nutritional deficiencies, the liver's working right, your thyroid's working right, everything else, then you're lucky to get maybe 3 or 5% EPA out of that alpha-linolenic acid, that parent form omega-3. It just, you can't do it. And you may not make any DHA at all, which is the brain form of omega-3 that is so important. We really were designed to get these things from animal source fats. Okay, that's how we evolved, and like it or not, that's how we evolved. So,
so we're going to do our best to get it from animal sources now.
Right.
From fish as clean as we can, wild as not factory farmed animals, not factory farmed fish.
Right. Yeah.
In these days, grass fed where we can get it.
Yeah, I primarily look to get my omega-3s from fully pastured animals. And by the way, that's sustainable. Okay, grass feeding animals is a sustainable way to get these animal source foods. If you're talking about getting your meat from feedlot animals, I'm right there alongside the vegans and vegetarians screaming about the unsustainability of that. It just can't happen. Monoculture agriculture is destroying the planet more so than anything else. And yes, they're growing a lot of soybeans and grains and corn or whatever to feed the feedlot animals. Well, we need to put a stop to that. There is no room for that in the human diet. You put an animal in a feedlot for almost any length of time, and you're basically going to destroy the omega-3 content of that meat. You're going to skew the fatty acid profile of that animal toward a higher omega-6 content that is going to be more pro-inflammatory, in addition to the fact that the animal is probably going to be fed genetically modified
and be
foods.
Sick because that's not the
And they
natural
get
diet.
sick.
So they give them antibiotics and hormones.
They live in
it's just a mess.
horrifically inhumane conditions. There's just no place for that. And I don't support that form of food production. The answer to that, in my mind, is not becoming a vegan. It is supporting the farmers and the ranchers out there that are working very hard to be ethical and do the right thing, to raise their animals in really quality conditions, letting them live out in sunshine, fresh air and sunshine, eating what is natural for them to eat, which is fresh green grass. That's what most closely mimics what our ancestors would have eaten, and it's what's right for us now too. But not only that, it's also what's right for the planet. In fact, the very thing that we think of that is commonly sort of vilified as a source for planetary destruction and the desertification of the planet and all these sorts of things, it may be the very thing actually that that could actually turn everything around. And I don't know if the people viewing this have heard of the work being done at the Savory Institute or not. The website is savoryinstitute.org, I believe. Alan Savory found through his work, and it's been demonstrated now, and millions of hectares of land on numerous continents already, that you can take what is already desertification, and you can reverse that in just a few seasons using nothing but grazing animals. And that by bringing back, by using animals in a way that helps to mimic the way animals evolved with the land, right? The massive herds that used to, thunder across the African savannas, which did just fine, thank you very much, before we came along and started putting them in small pens and feeding them unnaturally. That if you take and you attempt to mimic some of those conditions, and where the animals are going through and trampling areas, but also in so doing aerating and fertilizing the ground and whatever else, and then moving on because predators are moving after them and whatever have you. You can literally revitalize the land, revitalize watersheds, and actually have an impact on what is, fairly, in most people's minds, fairly demonstrably climate change. That is absolutely profound. And if you go online, anybody who hasn't seen Alan Savory's TED Talk,
it's
this year's TED Talk,
it's quite fascinating.
you need to run and not walk and look that up. It's a 2013 TED Talk, Alan, A-L-L-A-N, Savory, just like it sounds, S-A-V-O-R-Y. It's brilliant and it's moving, and it 2/3 of the planet is not usable for agriculture, and 2/3 of the planet is actually falling prey to desertification that could potentially be restored with this very, call it a primal technology, as a matter of fact.
Actually, what I see you saying is that both that fits so well the primal diet, right? Returning to our roots, if you will, as best we can. And returning to the land use, as it was when we first, co-evolved with these animals, is really optimal for the planet, for ourselves, for the whole.
It turns out that literally all mammals are designed to get their primary caloric intake from dietary fat, and in fact, as a matter of fact, mostly primary saturated fat. And this includes things like cows and goats and even gorillas. And the way this works is that in cows, what happens is, of course, they eat a carbohydrate-based diet. And if you're going to eat a carbohydrate-based diet, what do you see them doing all day? Now, they're physiologically designed to eat carbohydrates all day long, eat plant-based foods all day long, and that's what they do all day long. Their faces are in the ground, they're in the bushes, whatever else. They're eating constantly to meet their nutrient requirements. But they take that food in, and it goes into the gut, and then it gets fermented by bacteria. And what the bacteria ultimately produce out of that is butyric acid, is a short-chain saturated fat called butyric acid. Cows get 70 to 80% of their actual caloric intake from that from that fermentation byproduct. So they're eating the carbohydrates, but they're not operating on glucose either. They're operating on a fat-based metabolism. And as our gorillas, 66.9%, I believe, of their caloric intake comes from the same type of short-chain saturated fats from the bacterial fermentation. But these animals either have 4 stomachs or they have a greatly expanded large intestine and a much shorter small intestine that are just chock full of these bacteria designed to do nothing else all day long, but help to manufacture the nutrients that they need for their sustenance. We have a greatly expanded small intestine, a much shorter large intestine that renders us in need of getting these foods directly from to getting these nutrients directly from the foods we eat, as opposed to relying on bacteria to manufacture them for us. So that, that's literally how we're designed, and we are designed in that regard to the extreme. I mean, no other primate even comes close to the requirements that we have for fat and for protein. Yeah.
Really?
We're really at an extreme. The evidence is absolutely, I mean, it's absolutely clear that once we adopt ketones as a primary source of fuel, literally our cerebral blood flow and oxygenation increased by over 39% in normal human brains.
Big.
Yeah. Yeah, there's actually a guy in Sweden. His name is Jonas van Essen. He's actually number 6 in the world in memory and memory function, and his secret weapon for preparing for competition is to go on a very strict fat-based ketogenic diet for his competitions, because it absolutely gives him laser-like focus and radically improves his memory capacity.
Phew.
Yeah, so typically that it's the kind of thing that they're even finding now, not just a treatment for cancer, but also treatment for Alzheimer's disease, right? And for type 2 diabetes and even type 1 diabetes, if under proper supervision, it's very viable.
And more and more athletes using it
More
for
and more
long-term
athletes are using it.
endurance,
Absolutely.
without the carb things.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.
This has been wonderful, illuminating. I'll bet you learned a few things you didn't know about, and there's more.
There's a lot more.
That's why there's so many.
I'm just getting warmed up
That's why
here.
there's so many tabs in this book. With varying levels of depth. I mean, what's really nice in the book is you cover some of the things simply, and then you get into depth, and you cover as well, which we didn't even touch too much of, mood and some of the secondary diseases. Well, Nora Gedgaudas, author of Primal Body, Primal Mind. I'm Janaea Donaldson, and let this just be the beginning for you. Dig in. Thanks for watching.